Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Troutvetter. In this week's episode, FBO editor Curt Epstein explains why aircraft hangar foam fire suppression systems appear to be a solution in search of a problem. Air transport editor Gregory Polek discusses the relaxation of European Union travel restrictions, and senior editor Charles Alcock gives news about the first electric aircraft certification in Europe and the EVTOL industry in general. So, Curt, you did a story on inadvertent hangar foam discharges, and it also relates to the need for hangar foam systems as well. But before we get into that, let's go to the backstory of this. Has been a months-long story you've been working on. Why is it taking so long? What did you run into while you've been covering this?
Well, Chad, I first started working on this story last fall when NFPA issued the request for comments regarding its upcoming revision cycle to its 409 standard, which deals with aircraft hangar construction. And NATA is heavily involved in this, and they believe that there are changes that need to be made to this standard to change the requirements for having costly and problematic hangar foam systems installed. Now, as far as this goes, it's a problem that the industry may or may not be aware of because nobody wants to talk about this. In my article, I called it the social disease of the FBO set because it's something that anyone who's had one doesn't want to talk about. It's they view it as perhaps stigma of having had this. They don't want people who are going to be sheltering upwards of $50 million business jets in their hangars to have any sort of worry that this is something that might happen to their aircraft. But it is a problem that's growing. It's happened since 2004. It's happened 137 times in hangars across the world through all sectors of aerospace, from business aviation to commercial to military. And it's something that really is a costly problem and one that NATA wants to see more tightly regulated and more tightly defined as to what hangars require the use of these foam systems.
But right now, it's just guidelines. It's not even really a rule that hangars have to have this, right? It's just a guideline.
That's absolutely correct, Chad. NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, is an organization that comes up with these guidelines for fire prevention and fire safety, and it's up to individual municipalities as to how much of the standard they want to adopt fully into their own codes. I know of one case where an FBO just opened up a 31,000 square foot hangar, and they were not required to put in any hangar foam systems. Whereas in other municipalities, it's a given that if you're going to build a large community hangar, you are going to have to spend upwards of 25 and 40% of the cost of the hangar just on these foam dispensing systems.
Right, but it hasn't actually even been used for the type of fires that they're talking about, which is a fuel leak and then catching fire, right?
No, NATA issued a study from the University of Maryland to basically delve into the how effective these systems have been. And what they found was you have 137 of these false discharges. They've also found about 37 instances where the systems did discharge in relation to a fire, but that wasn't necessarily a fuel spill fire, which is what these systems were intended to fight. That could be an electrical fire, a fire in the wall, a fire outside the hangar that the systems detected, either through smoke or heat. In only one case over the past 16 years did they find one instance of a fuel spill fire. And in that case, the foam discharge system failed to deploy.
So why do local municipalities require this? I mean, is there a way? Obviously, some can be talked out of it, but why do so many push it when it really doesn't even effectively work?
Well, you have these hangars, and theoretically you have a hangar. It's holding a lot of flammable fuel, and on the layperson's view, these things are time bombs with wings. So, of course, anything that could minimize the chances in their mind of a conflagration is something that they'll require. So the initial standard was made back in the day when the hangars were worth more than the airplanes that were put in them. But today you could have one business jet which could be worth 10 times the price of the replacement of the hangar. So the equation's kind of been stood on its head.
Right, and there's also other problems when it discharges because some manufacturers require that the gear be replaced, and other things that it might touch could be corroded from the foam, such as avionics and things like that. So it can get real expensive real quick, right?
Oh, the costs of these things can skyrocket. And depending on how many aircraft are in the hangar, what sorts of aircraft are in the hangar, the price can go up from there. And these things get very complicated in terms of insurance as well. But as you mentioned, you have a wide spectrum among the OEMs of what their guidelines are for their aircraft that are involved in these hangar discharges. Some range for, just wipe it off, to other ones, take the equipment, disassemble it, examine it, clean it, put it back together again, to the far end of the spectrum where they're just like, if your aircraft was involved in a discharge, you throw this out, you throw this out, you throw this out, you replace them brand new. So it can really add up. As far as the avionics go, there's some manufacturers of black boxes that say if your aircraft was involved in a hangar foam discharge, replace the units entirely.
So Neta is trying to fight, the hangar foam systems. At least it's a blanket. How effective do they think they will be? Because it's so disjointed right now. Each municipality is different. So how do they get that message across that, hey, you really don't need this, unless you have this?
Neta has had a campaign now that's been going since the fall where no foam for GA, where they've been looking to have these standards changed. And what they have proposed is that there should be a different classification of hangar known as hazardous operations. And those would be your maintenance hangars where you'd be involving hot work such as welding, cutting, fuel tank repairs, other hazardous activities, pumping fuel indoors, things of that nature, where there is, as they admit, a definite increased threat for a hangar fire, spray finishing and things of that nature. But they argue that for your regular community storage hangar, and given the advances in aircraft manufacturing over the past 20, 30 years where their wing tanks don't leak anymore, and even the advances in fuel refining, which have raised the flash point for Jet A to higher, they say that the possibility of a fuel leak fire, which these systems were designed for in a general storage hangar, is very, very, very remote, and the statistics bear them out.
Okay, thanks, Curt. Let's go over to Greg. The European Union has started to say they'll be opening up airspace in the Schengen area very soon. So what's the news there, Greg?
Hi, Chad. Yeah, the European Commission just today issued a set of guidelines for the Schengen area states to lift internal border controls on June 15th and extend the ban on travel into the EU until June 30th. Now, the interesting thing about it is that the European Commission called for a process under which the Schengen countries would agree to lifting the travel restrictions on certain countries from outside the area. And the EC listed a number of criteria for deciding which countries would continue to be banned. And that would be largely based on their COVID situation, how many cases they have and how many deaths there have been. But there are other criteria as well, such as whether there are reciprocity agreements reached, and whether or not the particular country is doing a good job at mitigating COVID dangers. But at any rate, by that measure, the U.S., for example, would seem to be one country that would continue to face restrictions because it has the most cases in the world. So then that raises the possibility of retaliation. So you might see the U.S. continue to ban travel from the EU in like sort of a tit for tat scenario.
But there's not a whole lot of traffic between the EU and U.S. right now, anyways, right?
Well, not right now, but I mean this is something that we're talking about as traffic starts to go up. I mean things are starting to open up a little bit now, particularly in Asia. But I mean this is looking toward the future. So, like even later on this year, they hope there'll be traffic between Europe and North America.
So, what countries do you think would be allowed to fly into, or people from what countries would be allowed to go into? We're talking like New Zealand, things like that.
Right now, the Commission already recommended the lifting of travel restrictions from a lot of the Balkan states like Albania, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Serbia, given that their COVID situation is actually, if not similar, better than the EU. The wider question is which countries will continue to be banned. And it looks like if you go by how many cases there are, it would be like the top 5 countries would be the U.S., Brazil, the UK, Russia, and India. But like I said, there are other considerations that they're proposing as well. So it's an interesting situation.
So it could be a mixture of health and political reasons for allowing countries back.
That's very true. It could just cause a whole political firestorm in a way, just because you know how things go with the U.S. administration in particular, where there may be some tit for tat going on after, depending on what happens. I mean, I'm projecting right now, but if the Schengen area countries prevent the U.S. from flying there, I could see that the U.S. would turn around and do the same.
Interesting. All right. Thanks, Craig.
Sure.
So, Charlie, let's go over to you. There's been some movement on the electric aircraft front in Europe this week. The first electric airplane has been certified by the EASA authorities. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it is an exciting moment for those of us who are really counting on electric aviation to progress. At face value, you'd say, well, why is this so important? It involved a very small, light training aircraft called the Velis Electro that's produced by a Slovenian company called Pipistrel. But it is the world's first fully electric aircraft to receive full type certification, in this case by the European EASA agency. And what's really got people motivated is that this is sort of an important milestone test case. EASA, for more than a year now, has been trying to define the process by which it will certify, especially these new EVTOL urban air mobility aircraft. And in fact, just in May, they set out the proposed means of compliance with the special conditions that they're going to impose on those aircraft. And the industry has until July 24th to comment on that. And yet here, today, June 11th, it's not an EVTOL aircraft, it's a fixed-wing aircraft, but it's an important marker that shows you can do this. Pipistrel's a fairly small company, but very experienced and well-respected, and it took just 3 years to get this certification through. So it's extremely encouraging. And I think you'll see the EVTOL crowd kind of seizing on this and saying, look, see, we weren't kidding. We really can get these aircraft to market.
So let's talk about the EVTOL industry right now. Things are going okay during COVID, but it could be better. But companies are still making progress, right?
Yes, they are. And we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, the questions that everybody asks about the EVTOL sector in the context of COVID are, oh, well, there you go. Now that all this is broken, there won't be any money to invest in these programs. And, the whole thing that we were so excited about 6 months ago will suddenly seem less realistic. But actually, there's not too much evidence that the funding is drying up. At the beginning of this week, for example, Lilium, the German company, raised another $35 million when an investment group plowed some more money into them. I'd say that the money is still flowing, but it's flowing more selectively into those programs that can prove that they're credible. And I've said it before, I think what we'll see is an accelerated process of natural selection where some of the less credible programs will perhaps fail sooner. I would predict that by the end of this year, we're going to see quite a shakeout among the 200 plus companies that are vying for a place in this market. But we have seen real progress on other levels too. For example, just this week, Wisk, which is a joint venture between Boeing and Kitty Hawk, was able to resume flight testing of its Cora EVTOL aircraft, both in New Zealand, where, as Greg said, they've pretty much cleared up the COVID infection for now, and also in California. So they're back on track. They're saying that they're going to be able to step up work towards certification. And then just yesterday, another new startup company in California called Airflow announced that they're launching a fixed-wing electric aircraft focused on just cargo deliveries initially. And that's another significant point, Chad, because what some people are now saying is, look, some of this somewhat far-fetched stuff about, air taxi services in major cities like Los Angeles being in place by 2023, some of that is going to move to the right. It's going to take longer to achieve. But what you'll probably see sooner is a focus on delivering things rather than people. Because from a safety point of view, it's a lot easier to justify the leap into doing that. And also, one thing that the COVID crisis has taught us is, guess what? People really, really need stuff delivered to their front door now. So that's actually shifted the focus. A company told me yesterday that there'll be a more than doubling of the number of items that are delivered to American homes this year. And some of that stuff could be delivered by EVTOL aircraft within just a couple of years. So it is pretty interesting. And I'm more encouraged now that this whole EVTOL sector will stay on track. I just think it will morph in slightly different directions.
Are we seeing clear frontrunners here? And what does that mean for the others who maybe don't have as much funding or haven't made as much progress? And what about, more new entries? Is there room for them?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I if you put a gun to my head right now and say, name the front runners, I would say it would be companies like Lilium, Wisk, I just mentioned. Also in Germany, Volocopter. In the US, Jaunt and Joby, I think, are very strong players. It's not that all the others are finished and aren't going to make it, but these companies are clearly demonstrating that they can actually deliver on key timelines, and they are making progress. I reckon probably we're looking at maybe, just a couple of dozen companies that are going to succeed. I still believe that some of the major aerospace groups like Airbus, for example, are going to come back into play. I think they've just sort of gone underground, gone a bit quiet. Because they don't necessarily want to be prioritizing this in the current climate when other aspects of their business face such problems. And yes, I think there will be a weeding out. I really do. I think those companies that by the end of this year, or perhaps, let's say, this time next year, haven't been able to demonstrate that they have enough money to get across the finishing line and enough engineering capability, I think are going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lack of big name companies, even, in the business aviation realm, but is also, the air transport realm. I know Embraer is wanting to be in this space, and Airbus too, and Boeing. But, we haven't seen or heard a lot lately.
We haven't. That's true. I think it's just a question of priorities. I mean, with Embraer, I think that Greg would tell us this. They've got other fish to fry. They've got this whole situation where their deal with Boeing fell apart, and they're looking to recalibrate themselves. Probably the timing isn't right to be going on and on about their EVTOL plans when they have these other issues that need resolving. I mentioned there, Boeing are behind Wisk. They're the dominant partner in Wisk, so they're pretty serious. Airbus have done a lot of technology development work. I believe they're going to come back into the frame. Again, right now they're dealing with huge problems in the air transport sector where, half their customers are in the airlines are sort of falling apart. So I think it's just that the timing isn't right for them to be bragging about it. Stand by for next week, because I'm going to have news of a company I can't name now, a major aerospace group that's about to really step up its involvement in this space. So I think you are going to see more of that pretty soon. Okay, great. We'll look forward to that, Charlie. Thanks. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.